You're watching the video sermon podcast of First Baptist Church in Marble Falls, Texas. For almost 130 years, FBCMF has served the Marble Falls and the greater Highland Lakes area faithfully through children's programs, youth activities, and adult discipleship. We invite you to join us each and every Sunday at 9 and 10:30 a.m. for deep fellowship, rich worship, and a spirit-filled message. For those who find themselves unable to attend on a Sunday morning, we stream those services. Simply visit fbcmf.org/live during either of our service times to view it. Those sermons are then archived on YouTube for on-demand viewing and sharing. Never miss an archived sermon or video posted to our YouTube channel by subscribing to it at youtube.com/fbcmftube. For more information about our church and to hear an audio-only version of this sermon, please visit us online at fbcmf.org.
This is worthy, and we get to worship God forever. And because of that, we're going to start practicing and rehearsing and talking about worship and talking about our God and what that means. And so this morning, as we look at this, Jonathan, come on up, bud. All right. Stay with Miss Megan. That's a good idea. All right, kiddos, y'all can be released to blasting zone. I see that in the back. Is that right? Yeah, we didn't put up the deal. So kiddos, y'all can be released to blasting zone and launch pad. Unless you want to come up here with me. And that's all right. Bye, Jonathan. Gonna be a preacher one day? Who wants to take the bet? Who wants to take it? So our God, we're going to worship our Lord forever, and we begin practicing that right now. Today we enter into a brand new sermon series about what it means to worship, and the title is Live to Worship, and I hope that it's going to be interesting, and I hope that it's going to be exciting. Dory and I have been talking and praying about it for a long time, but the purpose is beyond any of you just understanding more about this topic, any more about this theology. If in the end of all of this you go home and you think, okay, I understand a little bit more, then you've missed it and I've failed and we didn't do what we were supposed to do. What this sermon series, I hope, is going to achieve is this, that it creates deep, deep within all of us a longing for God. And so we're starting with a man who is possibly the most worshipful person in the Bible. He is a king named David. And you know all about him. He is the same man who killed Goliath with a sling and a stone. He is the same man who was a shepherd boy. He is the same man who committed adultery with a woman named Bathsheba. He is the same man who almost lost his entire kingdom to his son Absalom. That's the guy that we're talking about. And one of the most remarkable things about King David was that he was an insane warrior, an incredible warrior. They would sing songs about him. That King Solomon had killed his thousands, but King David killed his tens of thousands. And these were the songs of a hero that they would sing and talk about. Picture William Wallace, but a Jew, King David, and he is exceedingly powerful. Now picture that same guy, and here's the funny thing. He was a different kind of a soldier because he was also a soldier who played a harp. And he is a soldier who wrote poetry, and he sang and he danced before God. Can you imagine? You're watching this military documentary, some very, very tough Navy SEAL, maybe like a lone survivor or something like that, and he's just been out in the battlefield, and you're watching it, and this particular soldier is incredible. I mean, he's just kicking tail. You know, he's awesome. And you're thinking, wow, what a man. And you move from the battlefield into another scene, and he has his knees on a pillow and he's plucking a harp. La, da, da, da. Like, what in the world? And then he puts the harp aside and he begins to write poetry for a little while. Welcome to King David, the real life most interesting man in the world. And And through it all, though, through all the battles, through the affair, through the losses, and through all of the victories, the most unique thing about this man is he never stopped wanting to please God. We find that throughout his entire story. He desperately wanted to. One time he said this in regard to his own worship: I will not give to the Lord that which cost me nothing. And we're going to talk about that in a couple of weeks. It's the idea that if you're going to worship God, you're going to offer him something that means a lot to you, something that costs you, something that's important. But I want to start here that worship with King David meant this, that he was going to give himself away in a way that helped him to commune with God. David worshiped God with an abandonment of himself, and that's hard to do. Abandonment of self. When you come into worship services, you say, all of the desires that I have, all of the selfishness that has been a part of my life up until this moment, as you connect with God, to be able to give all of that away, an abandonment of yourself. And to illustrate this idea of David worshiping with a sense of abandonment of selfishness, I give you, submit 2 Samuel 6, where David is worshiping God as the Ark of the Covenant is coming into Jerusalem. And the Bible says that his worship looked like this, that he started dancing in front of the ark as it came into the city. And that as he danced, he was only wearing what was called a linen ephod as he danced in front of the whole kingdom and in front of the Ark of the Covenant. Okay, linen ephod. They say that there are 3 parts to a linen ephod. You have the linen undergarments, and then on the top of that, you have a linen robe, and then you have the ceremonial robe on top of that. But when you read this text, it's not exceedingly clear how he was dressed. So as he was dancing in front of the ark as it came into Jerusalem wearing the linen ephod, it could have been a dance kind of like this. Here's a picture. There he is, okay? He's dressed, there's the linen ephod and everything, and everybody is rejoicing. It could have been that way, or the text isn't clear. It could have been that he's simply dancing in his linen underwear, and it looks like this. There we go. So we're not exactly sure, but we know this, that his wife, Michal, and I call her, it's probably really pronounced Michael, but I can't bring myself to call a woman Michael. Michal is furious with him, and the Bible says that she despised him for that. David's worship, though, regardless of what anybody else thought about it, was good worship. And here's why. In that culture, when the king would always come in ceremonies with pomp and circumstance, and he was dressed to the nines, he was everything, and everybody would be behind him, people would have a tendency to begin to worship the king rather than God. David found this out, that if he constantly paraded himself in, and he was always dignified, if he always had all of his pride about him, then eventually people might have the tendency to worship the king instead. And so David said, I don't want, in this moment, there doesn't need to be any question who the most important person is in this situation. I am not the most important. And in order to demonstrate that both to God and everyone else, I'm going to get as undignified as I possibly can. I'm going to humiliate myself. The king humiliating himself like this so that there is no question. He is God's child. Do not worship the king, worship God. And so he could have dressed all the way down to hardly anything, dancing in front of the ark as it came in. Now, granted, it's probably a little awkward for everybody. Have any of you ever experienced anything awkward during a worship service? I have. I was a little boy on a front row with my cousin, my uncle, minister of music in the church, Corpus Christi, Texas, and a little old church down there, and we were misbehaving while the pastor was preaching. And he looked at us, and he's a big old guy, and he looked at us. Back then, you remember this. Do you remember when the pastor and ministers, everybody would sit up on the stage? And so he was looking right at me, and so I stopped, and my cousin, though, continued to misbehave. So he came down off of the stage, and he grabbed him and was pulling him out, and my cousin yells in the middle of the worship service, "Help me, Jesus! Help me!" It was awesome, but one time I was preaching in another church, and a woman began, and if you're a part of the La Leche League, don't give me a hard time for this. There was a woman, and she started breastfeeding on the front row without any cloth, man. I mean, nothing. She just, right then, and during my sermons, I try to make eye contact with most everyone in the room, but I couldn't. The only appropriate thing to do was not make eye contact and just try to go on hard in a worship service. When I was also young, we were in a little bitty rural South Texas church, the kind of church that only farmers and ranchers went to, and probably only about 20 of them. So rural that you would have to take several unbeaten paths in order to get to this church. And we were there, and while the preacher was preaching, there was a dog right outside of the windows, and he was just howling throughout the whole worship service. And I mean, these are ranchers. And so one of them gets up and goes outside. The dog's howling. All of a sudden, bang! And I'm like, yeah! Did he really? Could he have really? But there was no more howling. I don't know. I've had cell phones go off in worship services. Cell phones, not so bad. One of them, though, the ringtone was Sir Mix-a-Lot. Baby's got back. Worship, man. Buckner Fanning, the great pastor at Trinity Baptist Church, tells a great story of a time he was doing a revival. And while he was preaching, there was a woman up in the balcony, and he could start to see her begin to almost lose consciousness, and she's up there just kind of swaying, and he's like, what's going to, and sure enough, there's kind of a glass, and this woman falls out of the balcony during worship. Well, the people around her, men and everybody else, they spring to life, and they catch her by the feet, and she's hanging like as if she would be right above all of you, just hanging there. Her dress falls over her head, and everything is falling there's hymn books falling and bobby pins falling on everybody, and she's flailing her arms and she's screaming hysterically, and they finally get her back up, and Buckner said, and like good Baptists, we just went right on and pretended like nothing happened at all. Worship service. In East Texas, I had a pastor preaching, and he was getting into it, man. And at one point, he said something, and his false teeth just poof, shot right out of his mouth. I don't know what kind of an embarrassment it must have been when David takes his clothes off and dances before the ark. Everybody thinks we were having worship, and now we're having something else. I don't know. It was an embarrassment for people to see the king lose his pride and to lose his dignity. It was an embarrassment. But David wanted to make a statement that my embarrassment as a king points you to somebody better than me, and that is God. And if pointing people to God in worship and helping you to know that God is the one that he says, then I will get even more undignified than this. Worship. In all of these ways. And so picture that king, King David, who wants God so much that he is willing to do all of that. Picture what he is going to do when God feels distant in his life. And he doesn't feel like God is there when he prays. He doesn't feel like there's a sense of connection, and he has lost worship. A man who loved worship so much, and now worship is lost for him. What does King David do? He sits down and he writes Psalm 42 out of this longing for connection, and he said this. And picture the man. He's there and he begins to write, and he says, as deer are dying of thirst, and they're panting for water, they're breathing heavy, as a deer pants for water. Oh God, my soul longs, it longs after you. We live to worship. But you know what? We also worship in order to live. Worship in order to live. And that is, we feel alive and we feel healthy. And we even process information more clearly when we worship. Now, if it's true that all of those things, if we process information clearly and if we have a purpose when we worship, it's also true that the opposite can come to fruition when we don't worship. If worship can achieve all of that, then imagine what the lack of worship can do. And that's where we find David. King David apparently is gone for a while without being able to connect with God. Have any of you in your life as a believer gone too long without connecting with God and worshiping Him? You begin to feel a lack of purpose in what God has done in your life, or you begin to feel empty or even confused about God's will for your life. You ever been there? Let me tell you why. Just like you were made to breathe, you were made to worship. You can't escape it. It's just who you are. Worship is the devotion of one's life to something or someone higher or better or more lasting or more important or more significant than self. And if somebody devotes his or her whole life and his dreams and his money to some great cause that he believes will be transformative to our world, then that devotion of his heart could be his form of worship. Worship is the meta-narrative that seems to be woven in your life like a thread of belief that gives meaning and purpose to everything else that you do. And from the earliest of civilizations to the most advanced of civilizations, people worshiped. Some of the earliest icons or paintings, some of the earliest things that archaeologists have found are relics in regard to people's worship. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Primitive culture or advanced culture, everybody worships. During the scientific revolution, they thought they were going to replace worship. But they didn't. It simply gave people a different God to worship. After 18th century Enlightenment, people began saying, isn't this great? We are no longer going to be duped by the myths of the church. Yay! You know, the church worshiping all of those imaginary deities that they can't even see? Oh, that's pathetic. And so what humanists did is they traded that and they started turning their lives over to worshiping the processes and the theories that they could not see, that they had to believe by faith. And what happened is they simply traded one kind of worship for a different kind of worship. And even atheists, many of them are very religious. They just have a very different God. And so this morning, as we talk about this, there is a necessity built within us to worship. Now, next week, we're going to talk about the God that we worship and how His story brings hope and His story makes sense out of life, and we're excited about the God that we worship. But this morning, understand how you are created. Our life feels stumbling and it feels restless until we discover that worshiping is what we were created to do. And so a moment ago I asked you the question. I don't know that I answered it. Have any of you ever experienced going for a long time without worshiping? And you begin to feel first a lack of purpose in your life, and then you begin to feel empty inside. And then last, you kind of begin to be confused about what God's will is and what's right and wrong and what you're supposed to do. It's kind of like this. If you go too long without worship, it's like going too long without water. There are stages to dying of thirst. Dehydration builds on itself. It starts out when you haven't had water for about a day. It starts with excessive thirst. And then it builds, and a person soon, in about 2 days of not having water, you begin shivering, and you begin to lose your color, and you begin to lose your appetite. And if there is still no water at this point, a person will grow weak physically, and eventually he's going to grow weak mentally, where he can't process information at all, and you begin to lose your mind. And this is the stage when people are on a life raft in the sea, or where if they're in the desert and they don't have water, this is when they begin to see things that are not really there. And a person on a life raft will think that there's an island over there, and he'll jump off, get eaten by sharks, because he thinks that he sees something. It's because a lack of water and dehydration makes you lose your mind. And then if you still don't get any water, finally dehydration moves to your body completely shutting down, and your muscles begin to spasm and hurt, and it's painful. And your heart then begins to finally spasm, and your lungs as well, until your body shuts down. There are also stages of worship dehydration. First, let's say that you don't worship for a couple of days. It's just a couple of days. But in those couple of days, you will begin to feel and experience that your days have little purpose and meaning. And even if you achieve something at work or achieve something at home, those achievements will not be able to be connected to a greater movement and a greater purpose of God, and you'll lose that. But let's say that you still don't worship and it lasts for more than a week. Then you can begin to experience an internal emptiness, begin to feel a little bit depressed, and life will just kind of seem like you're just going through the motions. You're going through things, but it feels dead. And at this stage, some Christians don't even know why they feel dead, and some of you might be in this stage right now. And you felt empty, and you begin to feel that emptiness with all kinds of other things. But let's say that you don't get it, and you still continue, and this lack of worship persists for more than a month. And then you can begin to experience confusion about what God's will is for your life, and what is right and what is wrong. And you begin to lose clarity. You will experience priority confusion, theological confusion, where things of little value are given great worth in your life. It's kind of like in that moment where a department store window, and in the middle of the night, an idiot comes in and reverses all the price tags, where the things of little worth are now, people are paying top dollar for them. And the things that are of most worth, it's just people are walking out the door. You don't worship, and all of a sudden, all of the priorities are mixed up. And if worship eventually ceases to be a part of your life, you will lose all of these things, and you will begin to resent your faith and hate the church and struggle theologically. I've experienced this. College students. College students will begin, when they're the most at risk, and as we're praying for our college students, they're the most at risk of pulling away from their faith when they stop worshiping. I'm telling you, man, it's not if they go to college and they meet some brilliant professor who is not a believer and tries to convince, that's not going to make them pull away from their faith. What will is when they quit worshiping. I've had college students come when I was a youth minister, and they'd come home. I'd be so excited to see them. And they'd come home for Christmas or summertime, and I'd have a conversation and say, well, how are you doing? What's going on in your life lately? And they would talk to me, and I'd say, well, tell me about your relationship with Christ. And they'd say, man, Ross, it's just different in college. I'm not close to the Lord the way that I was in the youth group, I can tell you that. It just seems very distant. And I say, really, why so? And they say, well, man, you just don't understand. College is different, as if I've not been there. And I say, okay. And I said, really, though, why is it that you think that you're not close to God anymore? And finally, they get down to it, and they say, well, I haven't been to worship this semester. Really? All semester? Not a single time? You've never been one? Not once? All semester you didn't worship. As a deer pants for water, so our soul longs after you. Those who do not worship begin dying inside. And I want to finish like this. Your life does not have to be going well in order for you to worship. When everything in this world is messed up and nothing makes sense anymore in your world, sometimes worship is the only thing that can bring back a little meaning and put some of the puzzle pieces back together for you. Sometimes worship is the only thing that can do it. It's like being in a huge, deep hole, and it's dark inside. Worship immediately brings a floodlight into the darkness of the places in your life. You remember Paul and Silas? They're in that prison in the book of Acts, that dark and dirty prison. And in that place, they begin singing hymns. They begin worshiping in the middle of that dark, dirty prison. And it's because of the worship that all of the chains were set free. It's because of the worship that God moved in the town of Philippi where that happened. But I want to suggest something, that Paul and Silas were free because of worship way before the chains ever broke off of them. The worship set them free even when they were in the chains of that moment. If you keep reading Psalms, you get to this moment when it's very difficult to worship. Let's say you keep reading from Psalm 42 and you get all the way to a psalm called Psalm 137. And there, the psalm is about this. Jewish life had moved on after King David. The Babylonians had come in and they had just annihilated all of Jerusalem. And they had killed people's parents and they had killed people's children. And all of life as they knew it was totally disintegrated. Imagine if somebody dropped a nuclear bomb on Marble Falls and on Texas and it annihilates everything. And then they took us into exile. Nothing is left. That's what happened to Jerusalem. And all of these people were marched out, and their temple where they once worshiped was totally gone. And now they were in a place called Babylon, and they were in a foreign land. It wasn't familiar. It was very, very different. But they remembered all that joyous worship that King David had done. You remember King David? He's dancing before the ark. You remember how he longed for worship? And they were like, we know, but how do we do that here? How do you do it when times are really, really hard and in this darkness? How do you do it there? And things were horrible in Babylon. And they remembered what worship used to be. They pictured the steps up to the temple and the beautiful structure and the sacrifices, and how when they offered sacrifices on the altar, it brought this emotion and this belief in Yahweh. And it helped them to worship and to draw close. It awakened their spirit. And now it had all been taken away from them. All of it's just gone. And in this foreign place, the psalmist cries out in Psalm 137. He says this. Picture them there. They're not home any longer. By the rivers of Babylon, they're not in Jerusalem. We sat and we wept. When we remembered Zion, when we remembered worship, when we remembered it all, we just wept. By the poplar trees, we hung our harps. Hung our harps, meaning we're giving up. There's a tree, I'm going to hang my harp up. It's like Dory coming in one day and saying, I'm done. I'm hanging up my guitar and I'm leaving. I can't do it anymore. And they hung it up and they began to walk away. And for there, our captors were asking us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. The people of Babylon were saying, come on, all of you Jews. Sing to us the songs of Zion. What did you sing when you went into your churches and in your temples? Sing to us all of those songs. And they said, sing to us the songs of Zion. And the people just cried. And they said, we can't. We can't. You can't demand us to worship. We can't worship like that. And they said this to even one another. How can we sing the songs of the Lord while we're in a foreign land? And there have been you guys at moments in your life when you said, how can I worship the Lord when I'm in a foreign land? When my life is totally fallen apart. How can I worship any longer at this moment? I can't. I just cry. I can't. I want to. And then at the moment of forgetting, at the moment when they said, how can we sing this in a foreign land? And they're beginning to hang their harp up. They're beginning to walk away. At that moment, they stop and they said, but if I forget you, I can't forget. If I forget you, Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. I can't. May my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, if I do not consider Jerusalem my highest joy. And the psalmist is saying, even in the middle of the exile, there is still a time for worship. You still remember who great God is and how wonderful He is. So let's say you've been empty and you've tried to take time off, but the restlessness just continued in your life. It never gave you the rest. It never materialized. Or perhaps you're dissatisfied with shallowness of life, or you cannot find anything that gives you a little peace or a little hope in the midst of this world. Worship again. Worship again. Remember to worship. I have seen people in nursing homes and retirement homes with advanced stages of Alzheimer's and dementia. And I've watched how some of them don't even remember their family's names anymore. And I watch their faces light up when you sing Amazing Grace. And they know every word of it. You sing How Great Thou Art, and they remember it all. The songs they sang long ago, they remember no matter what. In those confusing nursing homes and retirement homes, when they have forgotten everything else, they remember to worship God. Worship keeps us, and worship holds us. Oh, y'all, how you were created to worship. Remember it.
You've been watching the video sermon podcast of First Baptist Church of Marble Falls, Texas. Never miss an archived sermon or video posted to our YouTube channel by subscribing to it at youtube.com/FBCMF2. For more information about our church and to hear an audio-only version of this sermon, please visit us online at fbcmf.org.